welcome back to Speaking Queerly. My name is Mallory, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Civic Engagement and Advocacy Manager for Kaleidoscope Youth Center. And today's guest, I'm so excited about. I know I say that for every guest, but this one was very special because they reached out to us and wanted to see if we could connect in some way to talk about a new project that they're working on. So today we have Nico Lang, who uses they, them pronouns, and they're a longtime award-winning LGBTQ plus reporter who has contributed to outlets such as Rolling Stone, HuffPost, BuzzFeed News, Them, and The Daily Beast. And they're also a founder of Queer News Daily, which I'd love to talk to them a little bit about as well. But most recently, and why we have them on today, is Nico has been working on a new book that's coming out soon. It's called American Teenager: How Trans Kids Are Surviving Hate and Finding Joy in a Turbulent Era. The book chronicles the diverse lived experiences of 7 trans youth and their families who are navigating life in 7 different states in the US. The book will be released to the world on October 8th, but I had the opportunity to get my hands on a copy in advance, and reading into it, it is a fantastic, fantastic read. And I know we'll talk more about that, and I'm so excited to get to learn more about you and, your journey telling these stories, and I'm just so excited to have you on. So welcome, Nico.
Thank you. And I will have to start up top with a very slight correction. It's actually 8 trans kids,
Eight
because
trans kids.
it was going to be 7, but then, our in Florida, the family there, one trans teen turned into 2 trans teens when Jack's sibling Augie came out as non-binary. So
Okay. So it is 7 stories with 8
7
folks, right?
families,
Yeah,
yeah. But
right.
I always feel really bad when people say 7 trans kids, because Augie's entire chapter in the book or thread is about feeling erased. So I'm like, no, don't perpetuate erasure of Augie specifically. Don't
Right.
erase trans people, but especially not Augie.
And that was one of my favorite stories in the book as well. So I think it's just so it was just very powerful to hear kind of that dichotomy. And it really just goes to show that even within the same family, no 2 trans youth have the same experience. No 2 trans people have the same experience, coming out, discovering their identities, things like that. So yeah, I'm all about keeping Augie in the story, of course.
We are a
Um,
very pro Augie podcast here.
Yes, absolutely. Well, before we get into that, I want to know a little bit more about you, Nico. Like, tell me, I know you don't like this unstructured question, so maybe I'll give it a little bit more depth here. So we already talked about some of the things you're into for work, and in the interest of keeping one's identity a little bit detached from who they are as a professional, because I understand that that can be complex as well. I want to know a little bit more about, like, what do you do when you're not working?
God, these days not much because I'm working all the time.
Okay.
But
Okay.
um,
Bad
I,
question.
I'm really into the for lack of a better term, classic films, but not in the film school bro way. Give me like a black and white screwball comedy, or like an overwrought melodrama from the 1950s, and I'm there.
Oh,
I
good.
spend a lot of my so I live in LA, and there are a lot of theaters here who specialize in that sort of thing. So pretty much anytime there's something like one of my favorite movies or something I've never seen before, I always try to go out and get to it. When I lived in New York, I was seeing like 4 or 5 movies a week,
Wow.
because there's just so much programming there. It's really wild, like how much there is in New York. And LA, there's a little bit less, but it's still, it keeps me pretty fed. When I'm not doing that, what else do I do? Geez, what a question. It's like it sounded so simple, but I'm like, you're asked to account for your time. I'm like, I don't know. My husband and I have a long-term goal of trying to eat from a restaurant from every country in the world.
Oh,
It's very hard because some of those countries are really small. So it's like if you're looking for the island of Seychelles, right? Like where are you gonna find a restaurant for that? But I am determined it's gonna happen.
that is an outstanding goal. Now, are all of those restaurants in LA, or can you eat at them anywhere?
Anyway,
And what happens if you actually visit that country? Does that count as a restaurant, or it
totally
has to
counts.
be?
That's
Okay,
even because it's going to be more authentic. Because you
right,
don't like American Chinese food. It's Chinese technically, but is it
right.
like that's like Chinese diaspora food, which is totally a thing, right? And I recognize that as being valid. But if you want to experience the like the cultural cuisine of China, you don't really go to an American Chinese restaurant to do that because it's going to be an entirely different thing. Like when I went to Taiwan, I was just so enraptured by like all of the smells of like actual Asian food that I feel like we really miss here. That
Mhm.
even just like, in your like with your nose, it's such a sensory experience. And it's just a totally different thing in the US. And I love US Chinese food. Don't get me wrong. I grew up on that stuff. My mom worked in a Chinese restaurant when I was born. And our last name is Lang. So everybody would picture her, Kim Lang, as this Asian woman. And she's white. So they would
Right.
be surprised. But so yeah, I loved getting to like grow up in a Chinese restaurant a little bit. And I feel like that in a way sort of like was a nice table setting to want to keep exploring the world through cuisine. Because I feel like I'm not going to have the chance to travel everywhere as a person, although that'd be really cool. I would love to do that. Um, if I can't do that, I might as well just eat everywhere. Like that
Right.
sounds like a pretty decent substitute.
That is a really fantastic goal, the one that I had not heard of. Like I've heard of people wanting to branch out of their comfort zone with eating, but actually like committing to eating from a restaurant from every country. That's brilliant and something I might take for my own there as well.
You
I
should. It really opens your like palate and your like horizons a bit, and you'll just find yourself eating things you never would have before. I remember when I had my goodbye brunch in New York, I ordered all my friends balut at this like Filipino place that I took them to. And if you're not familiar, it's half-boiled duck fetus. And they bring it out and it's like this egg and you crack it and then you peel back the membrane and then you like drink it like a shot and then you like eat it, right?
Wow.
And my friends would do it. So I had to eat everybody's bullet for them. And my friend Anthony turned to me, who's Filipino, and says, I've never seen a white person eat like this before. And I have to say that felt really good.
Yeah,
Like
that's really cool.
he'd just never seen me eat before. And,
Right.
I was happy to regale him of that.
That is awesome. Well, what I like about that is it shows me that you're willing to like jump into these experiences and not just like learn a little sorry, you're not just learning a little bit about it through reading, but you're actually immersing yourself. And that's something that really resonated with me as I was reading your book, is just how, you weren't just talking to these young people over an interview, right? You were actually, from my understanding, like spending a lot of time with them, whether you weren't like living with them, but you were in that place where they lived and spending many days with them. And so that's something that, if you could tell me a little bit about the premise behind your book and maybe what inspired you to want to spend that much time immersing yourself with these young people. That sounds a little
Sure.
creepy, right? You were just spending a lot of time with them.
I was an embedded journalist, right? So it's
Yeah,
not like I invented the concept.
right.
But essentially, I spent 2.5 weeks with 7 different families in 7 different states. Let's see if I can do this in order. I always struggle. South Dakota, Alabama, West Virginia. Give me a beat. Oh no, I'm losing it already.
I've
Uh,
got your table of contents pulled up, so
no, I'm gonna do it.
okay.
Texas, Illinois, Florida, then California last. And my goal in doing that was to destigmatize the lives and experiences of trans kids because there's so much fear and misinformation that is being used right now to paint trans kids as these like political boogeymen when the truth is they're just kids like all other kids. They're just humans living in the world trying to get by. And I don't know like why we've decided to treat their lived realities as being so different than the rest of ours. Like it's just so strange to me as someone who's known trans kids and their parents for such a long time. Like I see all this political dehumanization happening and it's just so alien to my experience. Like you read this stuff and you're just like, where are you getting this? What families are you meeting? And the thing is, they're not meeting any families. They don't actually know these kids. So that's like what makes them able to do this to like paint them as these characters and these almost monsters, right? So
Mhm.
with this book, I wanted to show trans kids as who they actually are. These like diverse, multifaceted human beings who are just trying to like find their way in the world. And I think by doing that, it can like not only like make these kids feel seen and heard, often for the first time because they're so used to being just silenced and erased. But it makes it a lot harder to continue that political project of stripping away their rights.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I loved about this book is that you showed people from all different parts of the country, right? You had some from the South, you had some from, typically more blue regions, if you will, like California, Chicago. But the experiences and like I don't want to give away any spoilers, right? But like the places that you would expect the youth to have the hardest time weren't necessarily the most like, the stories that were full of the most struggle, if you will. And I think you did a great job of depicting them, as you say, as like this whole person with multifaceted identities and experiences to show that like not every trans person is going to have a completely miserable time in their coming out journey. And not every trans person is going to have this like perfect, like ticker tape parade type celebration when they're coming out either. There's, it ebbs and flows depending on who they're talking to and what setting they're in and what the politics are like in that state too. But even a state that or a city that has pretty good politics as it relates to supporting queer and trans youth, queer and trans folks in their state, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to have this like perfect experience either, whatever perfect looks like. So I think that you do a really great job of highlighting these different um experiences in a way, as you say, that humanizes them too, right? It's not just, it makes it a lot harder can to like bash an experience, a lifestyle, an identity when you're actually getting to know this person and see what makes them tick in a way, right?
Absolutely, very well said. I will push back a little bit though, in that I do think that like Ruby's chapter, which is our Texas chapter, is really important because it shows that even kids with like really supportive families and incredibly supportive communities, that if you live in a state where you don't have that same support from like the people in power, from your elected lawmakers and public officials, that it still makes it really difficult for you to continue to live in that state, to build a life in that state. So for folks who haven't read it, and I'm not super worried about spoilers, this book's good, so people should pick it up anyway.
Hmm.
So Ruby, she lives in Houston, Texas, with her mom, who is very involved in her church. Her whole family's very, very involved with her church. Her father, her older brother, they've all grown up in their like oh my God, I cannot say this, Episcopalian. Somehow that word is always a tongue twister for me. It really gets that childhood stutter, you know? But they've all grown up in this faith. And then when Ruby came out, rather than like kicking her out or rejecting her, they embraced her. She got to have a coming out party in the church. It's called like renaming liturgy, where essentially you sort of like discard your old name in favor of like the person that you were meant to be. And it's this like beautiful thing of being like lifted up and just loved by these people who have known you for your whole life. Like I having grown up in the church, never experienced anything like that. And you know what? It would have been great. So
Right.
jealous, but can't relate, as the kids say.
Right.
But nonetheless, despite all of that, and despite the fact that shortly before I got there, and one of these like sort of dream things as a journalist that you could never plan for, the boy that she liked asked her out, and they just started dating, and I got to like watch them fall in love. It was surreal. I could not have planned for this ever. It just
Right.
happened.
I mean, the way that chapter reads, it truly does feel like it was staged in some way because I mean, again, no spoilers, but like that was one of my favorite chapters because it's amazing how, it goes against every fear that I think a lot of parents have. When your young person comes out, whether they're coming out as trans, whether they're coming out as queer, whatever, there's always a lot of fear like, yes, I love you and I support you, but I hope the rest of the world does too. And a lot of times, like any sort of negative reaction that people have is one of, I don't want to say it's like always one of love, but like it can be one of love where it's like, oh, I love you so much, but I'm just so worried that the rest of the world won't. And you see that with the parents in that chapter. Like Ruby's parents are just so concerned that, that this relationship is not going to end the way that she wants it to, right? And to see that love, that respect resonating from, Ruby's partner, right? Like that's pretty remarkable. And I just love that you were able to witness that and tell that story.
It's very, very rare. But I will say that even with all of the serendipity of the chapter of me getting the opportunity and the privilege to capture this experience of this like young woman falling in love and this young woman like falling in love, like, I think any of us sometimes feel lucky to, right, like find that like special person. Even with all of that luck and good fortune, like Ruby still isn't able to continue staying in her state. Her ultimate plan is to leave Texas to go pursue college on the West Coast.
Mhm.
So it's like you have this girl who's got everything going for her, right? She's like stunning, she's radiant, she's like so smart and like funny and talented. She's got this amazing family, she's got this great boyfriend. She has everything like a young woman could want. But if her politicians don't support her, it's still in a way like it's not that the rest of it doesn't matter, but it still makes a really big difference in whether she's able to like have a future, right? She looks in Texas and she knows she doesn't have a future there. Even if she has like everything else going on, she doesn't have that one thing, and that's like laws and protections. And that's pretty big. Like you kind of like don't really have that much else if you don't have basic rights. It's like Maslow's
Absolutely.
hierarchy of needs, right? I feel like basic rights that like make it possible for you to exist are at the like very bottom of that
Oh,
pyramid, and you can build
absolutely.
anything on top of it then.
Absolutely. And that's something that, we're based in Ohio. I've lived in Ohio my whole life, and that's something that's like very resonant of the folks here in Ohio. In the work that I do, I go to the state house pretty often. I'm there testifying alongside trans youth, their families, trans adults, people who, maybe don't have a trans young person in their lives, but they see the value in supporting these young people. And it is, I mean, just heartbreaking to see how many young people that I get to interact with, both at the State House and here at Kaleidoscope Youth Center, who are, as you say, they have everything going from them for them. They're bright, they are clever, they are caring, they are, pursuing these huge aspirations, and they don't want to pursue them in Ohio. And you can't fault them, right? Go get out. And I always say that, if you have the privilege to leave Ohio, like, that it is a privilege to leave, and it's also a privilege to stay, right? And so those who do have the privilege to stay and who, aren't as directly impacted by these rights being stripped, you have this obligation to stay and fight to make it better so that people who don't have the privilege to leave are able to stay. You know what I mean? And that's everything that I saw in that chapter with Ruby, is just that conflict of, my family is here, all that I've ever known is here, and I can't stay.
Yeah, and but you see that with kids across the country, right? Like in Ohio and all these different states that are passing anti-trans legislation. We're now up to 26 states have passed either a trans sports ban or a trans healthcare ban or both.
Mm-hmm.
That's more than half the country. I don't know how that breaks down by population. It's probably about like 50-50 because
Sure.
California always throws things off.
Right.
But that's then, about half the youth in our entire country live in states that at least legislatively are like unsupportive of their existence. So their parents and their family members are having to make these hard decisions about whether they continue to live in a place that doesn't want their families to exist. So you see so many families moving to other states across the country, but also moving out of the country. That
Mm-hmm.
like it's becoming like increasingly common for families to go to Canada, to go to Costa Rica, to go to New Zealand, to go to Uruguay. I interviewed a family a couple months ago, or no, this was, oh my God, time is a flat circle. Last year for HuffPost, who had fled all the way to Uruguay just to make sure that their children could be safe and protected.
Wow.
So like, these stories in this book, what these families are going through, like as much as I'm so glad to have gotten to go this deep down the iceberg, like with these people who were brave enough to let me do this, it's still very much the tip. Like there's so much more here that needs to be explored. There's so many stories out there that need to be told. And I hope that seeing a book like this inspires people to do that.
Well, I guess that leads into my next question, is like, how did you select A, the states that you visited for this, but B, the stories that you told once you were there. Because you're right, like once you meet one person, then you're meeting three others. And, that with all of these states facing these same challenges legislatively, how did you narrow it down?
So the first three families were all folks that I already knew and that I knew had really good stories because the thing to me that was most important was not about like checking boxes necessarily. Although, diversity was really important to me with this and making sure lots of different kinds of stories were represented because I just felt like that would be more interesting to me as a reporter. It just gives you more to play with. To me, the most important thing was that I knew these folks had great stories and that like I connected to their stories in a really like deep and meaningful way, that there was just kind of something there, this like ineffable thing. And with the first three families, I knew we already had that because I already knew them. Susan's family, or well, Wyatt's family, well, let's center the kid. I'd known them for a really long time. Susan, his mom, is an incredible advocate, built the South Dakota Transformation Project, essentially to advocate for kids like Wyatt after her son came out. I've known them for years. Susan is probably like one of my most quoted sources, and I just think she's like fabulous. And I met Wyatt once, and I just thought he was the coolest kid. And I knew I was like, all right, if he's that cool of a kid, I bet he's going to have a story that really resonates with folks in this. So that was like really a privilege. And then in Alabama, I'd interviewed that family for Rolling Stone and I just loved them. They were just so sweet and kind. And I was like, I could spend 2 weeks with these folks. I feel like we would really get along and have a good time. And then in West Virginia, Micah there, I met Micah at a trans youth summer camp in West Virginia, and they just had this incredible larger than life personality. I had interviewed them for a story that I wrote about that summer camp, but they were just so like larger than life that they couldn't have like fit in that story, right? This like story that weaves together all these like narratives of all these kids for the 6,000 word piece. It would have added another 1,000 words just because Micah is just so much person in like every possible way and just like such, I don't know, a radiant light. So I knew that I needed to give them kind of their own spinoff. But then the other families, it was mostly referrals, right? I knew that I needed to tell stories in Texas and Florida because of everything that's happening there right now. And then the other two families were AAPI families. And that felt really important to me because we had a Puerto Rican family already, and we had a Black biracial family. I would have loved two like Black families in the book, just because I hate the idea of anyone ever feeling tokenized, right? The idea it's like, well, we did one, so we don't have to do another. Like, I never want anybody to feel like the only one. But telling AAPI stories felt really important in the trans space because I'd so rarely ever heard those stories. And I knew that if I hadn't heard them before, then like other folks were probably waiting for that. Like, and they were hungry for it in the same way that I was. So that was a real privilege to get to do. But to return to what I was saying before, for the most part, I just really loved those families. Like when we sat on a Zoom together, I just really connected with them and I could see us working together. Like I could envision that in my head. There was this like immediate spark and this kind of like intimacy that we were able to share like right up front. And I knew that I could use that to get a really great story because 2 weeks sounds like a long time, but it's not that much time to go really deep with folks. So we would have to have this trust right away to where we're able to get a lot of really great material and very vulnerable material out of folks in a really, really, really short amount of time. So
Absolutely.
it was all a big risk, but it worked out.
Yeah. And I like what you said before of like hopefully this inspires others to want to continue on and tell these stories because it's not like, unfortunately it's not like this is the end all be all of resolving the legislative attacks on LGBTQ folks. Like they've been going on for decades, they're going to continue on for decades, right? And trans people have always existed, right? Queer people have always existed. And so making sure that these stories stay in the fold of history is so important for people to be able to look at themselves and say like, oh wow, I see myself in this person. I see myself in this person from a book that was published however many years ago, right? Like assuming this is staying in the canon, right? And it's inspiring other stories to be told. Or alternatively, it's inspiring the young people who are reading this to see the value in their own story and to want to tell that as well. So I think that, I mean, while you can only tell so many stories, I think there's so much that people can find that resonates with them within these stories. I mean, the diversity is certainly palpable. So I think you did a great job with selecting your subjects.
Well, and just the stories themselves are so dense with information and like detail and richness that I always wanted the reader to be able to pick out something from every chapter, or like not even that, like every page, every paragraph that like spoke to them or resonated with them or that they would take with them. Because I was in this queer book club for 2 years and we would read these books that were often really good. And when we went to talk about them, I wouldn't remember anything,
Mhm.
right? Like I would struggle to recall these details from a book that I just read. And that's all fine and good. And maybe that's probably not the fault of the author. That's probably my fault for having a weird broken brain. But for the readers who were reading this book, I needed them to remember it. Like I needed them to take this book with them because like that's how we affect change. That's how we like change policy when like we don't forget these kids' stories and we start advocating for them. And to circle back about like what you were saying sort of about the historiosity. Wow, that's a word, sure, whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
This whole like I do want this book to be part of the historical record. To me, it was about writing history in the present rather than waiting like 20 years or 30 years to talk about how this is affecting our community and what it feels like to live right now. I wanted to do that storytelling work now because people need to hear it now. Like they
Right.
need to hear that their like experiences matter, that they're not alone, and a lot of other people are going through the same thing that they're going through. That when people read this book and they can see that these kids are feeling a lot of the same things that they're feeling, I feel like that's very normalizing in a way. It's, to return to a word, it's really humanizing, and we could all use a lot of that right now in this moment of just profound dehumanization. I feel like we're all being dehumanized all the time. So I just want all of us like to feel a little more like, I don't know, not human, that's not the word that I'm looking for, but secure, like after like 8 years of just feeling so uprooted and so unmoored by everything that's happening in the world. So many people I know just feel really lost. And we sort of have to find our way back together. And I hope that this book is just a little piece of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the thing that really resonated with me, and I want to say this came at the end of Clint's story, where Clint said something about like, this is going to be the last piece of trans activism that I do. And when I read that, I was kind of like, oh, like that's so sad to think that Clint's not going to continue on with this activism. He's so well spoken and so just involved in his community. And then I had to check myself and be like, no, like nobody should have to spend their life advocating for themselves, right? Like if you do, that's great. Like everyone should have some self-advocacy, right? Whether that's just saying like, oh, waiter, like my food was made incorrectly at a restaurant, right? Like minor self-advocacy down to like, no, I deserve to be seen as a human in all these facets of my life, right? And I think that, that was really poignant for you to include that, to show people like, wow, you've just connected with this person. You've seen how they've been fighting to be seen as who they truly are in all of their, all facets of their identity and in their communities. And to be like, no, I'm done. Like, I don't want to keep doing that. I just want this to, I want you to see me as the most boring person you know. Yeah, I want you to see me as just any old human, right? And that really, really stuck with me. And I was just so grateful that you included that because you talk about the longevity of your book, the historical nature, the longevity of the stories. Who are these people but just, regular folks in South Dakota or in South Dakota, Alabama, anywhere, right? They're just regular people and they shouldn't be seen as these like profound, creatures, if you will, right? They're just humans. And I think you do a great job of showing their dignity, their humanity.
Yeah, it's really interesting or fascinating that you bring up Clint's chapter because in the really early drafts of the book, when we were sharing it with sort of like pre-readers and like members of the community to just see, what do you think about this? Do you like the direction it's going? Are there any parts that feel like problematic to you or off base? Are there ways that we can just make this better? so many people chafed against like Clint's chapter because like hearing that a kid didn't want to pursue activism just like rubbed them the wrong way. Because I think it wasn't what they wanted for themselves in their life or the way they thought like a trans young person should be. That like, of course you should be out there advocating and fighting for people. But the thing is that pretty much none of the kids in this book actually want to be doing this. And you hear that over and over again in different ways. Like Wyatt and Ridian both feel like they didn't get a childhood, right? That they're like they had to sort of sacrifice their childhood to other people. And in Wyatt's case, the way he feels his childhood was sacrificed is that he had to spend so much of it fighting in the legislature for his rights, right? He was like, traveling to Pierre all the time. It's pronounced Pierre, by the way, a little pronunciation lesson. So if you were told it's Pierre, South Dakota in school, it is not. That place does not exist. It's called Pierre. But anyhow, so he was traveling to Pierre, you know, weekly, monthly with his mom sometimes during legislative sessions. He was out there putting a face on the struggles of trans kids all across the state and all across the country. That's really hard work when you're like 13 and you haven't even been out as trans that long. Like suddenly you're like the face of a community. And that weighed really, really, really heavy on him. And with the amount of time that they were all devoting to this, like it's important work. I think he understands that someone had to do that work and he feels privileged in a way that he has the supportive family that meant that he could do that, but he shouldn't have had to. And
Right.
he's now 17. He just went off to college, and I hope that that's not a spoiler, but if it is, too bad. It's already been spoiled. And he'll text me all the time because we've stayed, pretty close, like pretty in touch. And he asked my permission to do like random kid things. He's like, I'm going to a party tonight. Do you think that'd be a good idea? And I have to be like, well, of course, you check to make sure that there's nothing illegal happening at this party. But then you're like, yes, absolutely. You should be going and having dumb kid experiences the way that I did when I was 17. And
Hmm.
he's still getting used to that. He has to like give himself permission to be just a normal teenager. And he doesn't know how to do that yet. He talks to me about that all the time, that he doesn't know how to just be a kid. And he doesn't have that many years of it left, right? You even see Ruby in a different way, that she gets this like beautiful relationship, right? Like right at the end of her teenage years, this thing that she's been waiting and waiting and waiting for. And I feel like all of these kids have to end up like putting off so much of the rest of their lives because it's like not only are they fighting for their own medical care, if they're over 18 in a lot of places, they're fighting for their surgical care. They're doing all this like advocacy and self-advocacy. And then how much time do you then have left over for yourself? So
Hmm.
for those kinds of folks who might be uncomfortable with Clint saying that, I hope they pay a closer attention to the book and really hear what these kids have to say, because these kids are telling you they just want to be kids. They don't want to be doing this. Like they want to just like go to the beach with their friends or like have a nice day. Think about all the things you did as a kid. A lot of these kids aren't getting the same opportunity or privilege to do that. So I want that for them. I hope that at some point we get to a place where no kid is forced to be an activist if they don't want to. Every like child should have the opportunity to follow whatever path they want. And for trans kids, that means not being an activist if they don't want to be.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail right on the head, right? But I think we glorify youth activists, right? And in many cases for good reason, right? Whether it's like, I don't know, I think of the students from Parkland several years back when they, were taking a stance against gun violence. I think of, youth climate activists. I think of, obviously young trans activists like you're talking about in this book. And we glorify them because we're like, wow, when I was in high school, I certainly wasn't advocating for these greater societal issues. But that's because you had the privilege to just go to your high school homecoming and not worry about like, will I be perceived differently because of what I'm wearing? Will my safety be in jeopardy? Right? I think about, the privilege that it takes to not even know that these issues exist, right? Because it's not like back in my day, it's like not like these issues didn't exist, right? But to have the privilege to not be aware of them. And you're absolutely right. I feel that way about nonprofits. Like nonprofits shouldn't have to exist. Activism shouldn't have to exist because we should all just be living with these, this in this utopia where everyone has the rights that they deserve, as we talked about earlier. But I think it is so important to give people that, space to advocate for themselves and others and to not push their voices out of the conversation, but also acknowledge that if you don't want to be part of this conversation, you can go, hang out with your friends, go to that party. Don't feel like the solution rests on your shoulders, right? Like you are not solely responsible for changing the minds of the people in your legislature, right? It could feel that way, but it's not your entire responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, it should be allies helping pick up that work, right? Like train
Absolutely.
and do all this and like do all this alone. They shouldn't have to be shouldering all this work. But I think that Kylie says it best in her chapter. So Kylie was my California teen. She is a Japanese Hawaiian teenager who lives in California with her parents, who are awesome. And I got to spend 2.5 weeks with them, and it was so much fun. But Kylie thinks that her version of advocacy isn't fighting at the front lines. Like, it's not like, letter writing campaigns. It's not public speaking. It's not all this stuff that we associate with being activism. It's simply living her life and being herself. And I do think that that is a really powerful form of advocacy that we just like don't often talk about. That if, let's say, you are working in an office, right? And Kylie is working in your office, you know her as this like cool, amazing, awesome, like out trans woman who's just like living her life and like, doing herself. That's like pretty powerful because it makes a difference in terms of how you vote. Studies have shown this over and over and over again that if you know a trans person, if you have a trans colleague, a trans like somebody at your office who's trans, or you have a friend or family member, you're more likely to vote in favor of their rights and their right to exist. And for Kylie, if she is out there doing that, if she's like just being visible in her own community, like being fabulous and amazing and having this cool life, that's like actually pretty important activism because all of those people who know her are then more likely to vote in favor of her rights. So that's like, I think we need like this high and low, right? Where everybody's engaging in their own kind of advocacy and we're all recognizing that as being valid. Like she wants to be like just like a beauty influencer, right? Who's like sharing her little nail tips online. And if people know her as this like cool beauty influencer who just happens to be trans, like that's a trans person they know. Then, 100,000 followers of hers know a trans person, and maybe they don't have that in their like daily lives. So I think that like what Kylie is talking about is really valid. And we all just need to make space for each other to be the kind of like queer people and trans people that we want to be in the world. Not everyone's going to walk the same path and not everyone's going to have the same life journey. And we just need to respect that.
Absolutely. And I absolutely love how you highlighted, especially in the last chapter of this book, exactly what you just said, right? Like sometimes activism is just showing up as yourself in the spaces that you already occupy, because that takes courage, right? Like it takes courage to stand up in front of the legislature and testify in a committee hearing, right? Like it takes courage to be on the front lines at a protest, advocating for your rights and others' rights. Like it takes courage to do these things, and it takes courage to show up as your authentic self sometimes. And you have no idea who's watching, right? Like those folks who are your coworkers, who are your classmates, whoever they are, they could be looking at you and thinking like, okay, I'm going to vote for somebody who protects your rights. Or they could be looking at you and thinking, wow, now I feel like I have the courage to be myself more openly too, right? You have no idea what those folks in your life are feeling or they're going through. And by you coming to work in a dress where you had been wearing pants before, by you deciding to change your names and sharing that with others, like you have no idea how that's going to inspire those around you. And that is activism, right? And I just think that that is so important to highlight because, everything that we've just talked about, I work with young people every day here at KYC who feel that they have to be at these protests, right? And it takes a huge toll on their mental health. There are young people who they want so much to testify at State House committee hearings and just want to be a student first. They don't want to skip class so that they could go and tell the legislature why they deserve to exist, right? And I think that just them showing up to the spaces that they occupy as themselves is doing more than they realize. So I appreciate you seconding that.
Well, think about it this way, to not like, beat too much of a dead horse here. We talk so much about like possibility models in terms of people like Laverne Cox or like Elliot Page. And that's really important, right? The work they're doing is absolutely critical. And I don't want to diminish that. But I feel like all of the possibility models in my life, the queer people who made my life more possible, were people that I knew, right? Or I just saw, like going about their lives, like being fabulous. And I
Right.
think sometimes about that there was this moment once in an elevator where this little boy asked me about my shoes. And they were leopard print and they looked amazing. I was really like dressed head to toe that day. I was doing it. And he asked me about them. And I said, "Oh, they're leopard print. That's my favorite color." And he thinks about it for a second. He sort of like screws up his face because at first he's like, "Leopard print's not a color. What are you talking about?" And then he says, "Oh, me too." Like now that he'd considered it, right? And I don't know if that kid's gonna grow up to be queer. Like, who knows? But like there's so many moments in my life in which I saw somebody who presented something to me as a possibility, even if it was just like leopard print being a color, right? And something that I'd never even considered before. There was a time in my life I didn't even know that queer people were a thing, right?
Right.
And then I didn't know that you could be bisexual, right? The idea that you could like more than one gender, that had to be presented to me as a possibility. And then when it was, it opened a new world to me, opened a new experience. And we're often doing that for each other, not just in media representation, not just in books like this, but in our daily lives. So people like Kylie, just by being themselves, being their like vibrant, fabulous selves, are like giving us those possibility models all the time, just walking down the street. That is incredible, important, courageous work. And we don't talk about it nearly enough.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think every queer person, every trans person can name that moment. I mean, it's like the Ring of Keys trope, right? You see a lesbian with the carabiner and the keys on her hip, like you just know, like, oh, you're queer, right? And so I think everybody can name that Ring of Keys moment in their lives where you saw yourself in this like average person in your life, right? That you could be somebody at the grocery store who crossed paths with you, but you saw something and you were like, oh, I feel like I have permission to do that too now because I saw somebody else like leading the way. And I think about, there was an internship that I had right out of college, and I was sitting across the hall from this woman. And, we would just come in, we'd talk about the podcast that we listened on our way to work. We developed this friendship on, the books that we were reading, right? And she would always talk about her partner named Sam. And I just assumed, right, Sam must be a man, right? Because, I live in society and heteronormativity is pervasive. And I just assumed Sam was a man. And then one day she dropped the she, her pronoun when referring to Sam. And I went, she's a lesbian. No freaking way. And this was right as I was coming out, feeling that like, am I gay? Am I not? That back and forth where you're really just trying to grapple with your sense of self. And seeing this person sitting across the hall from me, literally, I mean, she was not doing activism in the traditional sense, right? She was not like saying, hey, come with me to the state house. We're going to do this, right? But she just showed up as her authentic self and talked about her partner, right? And I was like, in a way that I hadn't had before. And I think that, when I departed at the end of that internship, I wrote her a thank you note, just being like, coming out to her and being like, no, thank you for just showing up as yourself. Like you did not go out of your way to be extraordinary. And yet for me, you were. And you have no idea the anecdotes that you share with a friend. You have no idea the leopard print shoes you wear, how that is going to resonate with someone. And I guess my question for you is like, what was your moment like that? Like, can you look back to younger you and think of a moment or a person where you felt that you were able to like be yourself because this person was their own self?
Oh, I absolutely know. And I do think it's really funny that you had that. Have you ever seen that video clip of Britney Spears discovering that Ryan Seacrest is straight? And she's like looking back and forth like this, and she just mouthed the word girl. You totally had that exact moment.
Right. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. You had your like Harold, they're lesbians moment.
Right.
Uh,
Exactly.
but
Exactly.
But for me, it was actually so I grew up in a flea market I spent a good part of my childhood in a flea market because my mom helped run it in Batavia, Ohio, which is sort of a couple towns over from us. And it was kind of podunky, but a little bit of a cool way to grow up because it's just like there were just so many different types of people there. And some of the people who owned the booths were really interesting. Like, people would bring their art and they'd bring books, and I just like hang out with them and like talk all day. I would just go with my mom like every weekend to just like socialize. And it was a really great way to grow up for a while she had that job. My mom had a series of very cool but like extremely low paying jobs. She also worked in a video store, which when you're just like a 16-year-old nerd was just like drugs. Right. Because it's like you get to watch any movie you want all the time. And sure, you don't have any money, but at least you get whatever movie you want. So isn't that nice? But there was this one woman who had one of the book booths, and she would bring whatever writing that she was working on. And I would just go over and I just like write with her. Like she'd write in her like notebook and I would write in my notebook, and we would just like swap. And she taught me the art of people watching, which inevitably led to checking people out, right? And there was this one day where she was talking about guys she thought were like really hot, like in our like immediate vicinity. And I was doing that thing that sometimes like, like young, like male presenting people do, where I was like, oh, I don't know, I just can't find guys attractive. Like that just I just can't tell, right? And she just looked at me and she said, you know.
Oh,
She's like,
wow.
and she said something. She was like, "You look at that man and tell me whether he's attractive or not." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I was like, and it was in fact a very hot man. So she picked a great specimen, and I was like, "Yeah, I guess he is pretty attractive." And you just one thing led to another, and then suddenly we were just checking guys out like every weekend, and it was like the first time in my life it had ever been presented to me as being either like a positive thing or just like an ethically neutral thing to like find men attractive, because it had always been coded as like being bad, right? Like this is like a shameful, like stigmatizing thing. You don't want to do this, right? Like if you are queer, you will get AIDS and die, and you'll have a miserable, lonely life, and all the stuff that young young queer people are told, or proto queer people, right? So for me, that was like the first moment in which anybody ever showed me like it's okay. You can just be yourself. You can just do you. And I'm totally chill with that. I don't think she really knew one way or another yet. She probably, could have surmised. But like, whatever I wanted to present or whatever I wanted to bring into that space, that was okay. And I just never had that before. And it just felt so, so, so freeing. And it also made for better writing. Like I did my best writing as a kid when I was with her, because it was this person that I knew I could share anything with. And, it would be validated, it would be seen.
That is so cool. I mean, I just think about like, I first off, I really like that you described that experience as like potentially ethically neutral, right? Like it's neither good nor bad, right? When somebody, a heterosexual teenager gets their first crush on somebody of, quote unquote opposite gender, you're not like, wow, that's a great thing. Good job. You have a crush, right? Like it's neither good nor bad. It's just something we expect to happen. And so I really like that you like give that possibility of like it just is, right? You don't need to applaud me for having a crush on, whoever. You just say, okay, cool, and move on. And I just think that is such a cool thing that this like adult in your life, whether she knew you were queer or not, but she probably saw like that was a possibility and just gave you the space to explore that, right? In a safe, comfortable setting, right? And I think that that is just such a testament to like allowing young people to explore who they are and not putting them in boxes right off the bat and assuming that like, just because you say you are one thing now doesn't mean that that can't change later. That is what being a young person is about. But giving people that space, that invitation to explore that in themselves, it just opens the door for so much down the line too.
Yeah. I was a pretty effeminate kid who named their scarf after Bridget Jones of Bridget Jones's Diary because I liked rom-com so much. So I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure I would have figured it out, you
Right,
know?
right. Choose context clues, but I think
Yeah,
like,
she doesn't have this.
at that point, had you like started to realize that you were queer or
No idea. I was a
Really?
really dumb kid. I was always the last to figure anything out. And I'm still like this as an adult. Like if there's ever like a joke, like somebody like tells a joke or like a knock joke or something like that, I'm always the last person around to get it. Like it just takes me a really long time to absorb information, like in a way that I think is not true necessarily of other people. And that was also true of myself. I think there was a part of me that just felt like maybe everybody felt this way, that
Mhm.
everybody was just like attracted to guys and to girls. And because you were expected to be straight, you just sort of suppress that part. It's
Mhm.
like, you know, oh, of course I can't do that. That's silly, right? I couldn't possibly actually like do anything about this. You just like girls, and that's the thing you do. And it was especially confusing for me because I did like girls. I've always been really interested in lots of different kinds of people. I think my biggest requirement is that like I'm just interested in people who are different from me. Like
Mhm.
difference to me is like fascinating and interesting. I think it's one of the things that makes me a reporter, is that like I want to know how other people experience life and experience the world. So the most boring thing is somebody who's the same as me. So like in being like a queer person or like a bi person or a pan person, whatever you want to call it, it's just to me like that's the thing that really attracts me is somebody who's going to like, I don't know, show me a different way of like being a person. Like that
Mhm.
feels really cool and like sexy. And as a kid, that had never been presented as being a thing to me, right? Bi, let alone pan, let alone like omnisexual or any of the other labels that I now have access to. So it just didn't occur to me that could ever be a possibility. So it was just a profoundly confusing time. Literally, I think I was 14 when I discovered when someone presented to me that bisexuals exist. And
Right.
that was a big moment. So, and we never really went back after that. It took me a very short amount of time to come out after, like, I literally learned bi people existed, and it was like 4 weeks.
Wow. That's impressive. Yeah, no, I'm totally with you there. I was, the funny thing, this will be part of my eventual comedy sketch, right? Is like I was in all these women's and gender studies classes. I was in all these queer theory classes in college. I had friends who were queer. I was totally supportive, right? I would often say, gosh, like I just wish that I was gay, right? Yeah, spoiler alert, straight people probably don't think that, right? But it took a friend of mine, I was at a friend's apartment lamenting the fact that one of my other friends was, talking about boys constantly. She was on the apps and she was like, oh, look how cute he is, right? And I was like, ah, that's nice. Get me out of here. And this friend of mine was like, well, okay, well, do you think that way about women? Like, do you like looking at women? Do you find them attracting? Do you find them appealing to you in any way? And I kind of the same as you, I just was like, yeah, but like, doesn't everybody? Obviously I feel attracted to women, but like, doesn't everybody? And she was like, no. So all the signs were there, right? But sometimes it just takes that person in your life, whether explicitly in my friend's case of being like, yeah, no, I think you like women. I think you're gay, to like, somebody very gently offering you the opportunity to explore that facet of your identity, right? And it just shows that that woman in your life, that friend of mine, like they probably did not see themselves as activists, right? They just saw themselves as a supportive person in a young person's life or a supportive friend. And it just shows that how you go about your everyday existence can be activism without you realizing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it just maybe like forces us to all ask ourselves, like, what can we do in our daily lives to be better activists? Not in the like big activism way of like marching on the front lines, but
Right.
it just make people's lives possible.
Right. It's super daunting to think about, as a person with a full-time job and maybe you have kids and maybe you have other, obligations after work, right? It can be so daunting to think, oh gosh, now I got to sit down and call my state representative, right? You don't
Yeah.
have to, it doesn't have to be that. Some people, yes, absolutely. Like, and we need as many people as possible to be vocal in that way. But if the most activism you could do is putting like a pride flag sticker on your cubicle at work, just so somebody knows, like, okay, I'm cool with being myself around you, that's huge, right? And maybe that inspires other people to do the same.
Or even just something as small as like, I don't know, like you got an Instagram account, you got a Facebook account, right? Just putting up your like silly little gay meme, right? Like
Mhm.
sometimes like making other people's lives possible doesn't have to be super deep, right? It doesn't have to be this like, I don't know, big heady thing. It can just be like I don't know, sharing your silly little gay stuff with people who need silly little gay stuff. We
Right.
love that. For me, I think that's one of the reasons that I do Queer News Daily, which for folks, if you're not already following me, please do because I need the likes. It is a daily, well, these days daily-ish because I'm releasing this book, Instagram account that posts stories that I feel like matter. I try not to get too into like celebrity things because they're doing fine and they don't need the free PR. But I talk mostly about like statewide policy, like national policy, things that are happening in our political system that people need to know about, like rights and protections being stripped away. It's sometimes a little on the sad side, but I try to keep it light as much as possible. I try to post a little bit more of the good stuff than the bad stuff. And I do that because I want people to be informed. I want queer folks and allies to know about what's going on in the world so they can do something about it. But I hope that for that person, maybe who's in the closet or who hasn't had the courage to like come out and tell other people who they are yet, that like it reminds them in some really small way that there are folks out there, right? That there are folks who've been out there for a long time, who will continue to be out there, and who have been fighting for that person's right to exist for decades. And whenever they're ready, right, we'll be waiting for them and we'll love you and we'll accept you with open arms. So I hope that in some small way, like that visibility just reminds people that like there is a community out there and to keep going, that they'll be part of it someday, whenever that time is right for them.
Yeah. And it sounds so trite to say like, oh, you're not alone, right? Because that's like the first aphorism people share, right? But it's so real. And when you're a young queer person, maybe like not growing up in LA, New York, Chicago, right? It can be hard to see yourself in the people who you're immediately surrounded by. So I think it's really powerful to be able to open up social media, to be able to open up a book, to listen to a podcast where you can, see yourself reflected and just know that like there is hope. There is somebody out there who's just like me. There is a community, right? That's super powerful to feel like there's this whole group of people waiting with open arms, whether that's metaphorical or literal, to welcome you into this space. And I think the book that you've written has absolutely the power to showcase that, right? Because you showed people in those big cities, but you also showed people in just everyday towns and everyday states, and I think that that is really going to have an impact on folks. I want to
And I
know.
think that, what was that?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I want to know, like, we talked about the people who, as a younger person, allowed you to be your space, allowed you to be yourself and give you that space to do so. I want to know of the stories and of the young people that you spend so much time with while working on this book. What are some of the takeaways that you took of like, wow, I'm going to see the world a little bit differently now because of this?
I don't know if there was anybody that caused me to see the world differently, but I did just think it was valuable to find out like how all these kids see the world and how they experience it. Like, Clint pushing back against activism and being his own kind of activist, or just rejecting activism, right? Like that was like, I feel like important to have reaffirmed for me that we're all walking our own paths and we have to let each other do that. And then you've got Jack and Augie in Florida. Augie is a non-binary kiddo who has had a really hard time uh, finding their way, I think, as a trans person, because when you're non-binary, there aren't that many ways to really signal like that you're non-binary to other people in a really clear way. That for Jack, their sister, like it's easy that if she wants to be seen as a girl, and everything bound up in like femininity, you dress feminine, right? As a non-binary person, though, what do you do to signal like I don't adhere to gender norms, and I don't want you to gender me? There just aren't those like, I don't know, easy reference points for people. And because of that, Augie is always being misgendered like over and over and over again. And is very rarely ever gendered correctly by strangers. And if I'm thinking about that, I highly doubt they've ever been gendered correctly by a stranger. And that's a really big struggle for them. And just talking about their own kind of non-binary experience that even for me as like an adult, felt really normalizing because I'd never heard someone talk about the kind of stuff that they talked about before. That as a trans person and as a non-binary person, they don't really feel like both and in the way that a lot of or some non-binary people do, where it's like, oh, I'm a little bit masculine and I'm a little bit feminine, that they feel neither, right? And that that's their own personal conception of gender, is that they just opt out of gender altogether. And that's sort of the way as a non-binary person, I feel that I don't feel like a little bit masculine or a little bit feminine. Like I'm not necessarily trying to like put on like nail polish or like lipstick or and stuff in the way that like other non-binary folks who are like maybe like assigned male at birth do, right? That's sort of the way that they like play with their gender and carve out space for themselves. I think it's really cool that they do that, but it's just so not me. I always think that I've just looked really silly in lipstick. Like other people really rock it, and I'm like, good for you. But it just doesn't like. I'm like, oh, that doesn't look right on me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know what is my non-binary presentation. I've always struggled with that personally, and just hearing somebody else who also struggles with that, even somebody so much younger than I am, it just felt really like needed and necessary for me. I didn't know that I needed that, but I did. And, this circles back to something I wanted to say, that I think this message about carving out space for yourself and making it possible for other people to exist, this isn't just a message that's important for trans youth. It's also important for queer and trans adults too. Because we forget sometimes that there are people who have to wait a really long time to come out, who wait till their 30s or 40s or 50s or even like much older to finally like live their truth. There was this guy who just came out in his obituary, right?
All that,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. And there are so many reasons that they have to delay that. Like can have to do with your job, your local community, your religious tradition, how supportive your family is. But these kids, I think, do such a really brilliant and brave job of making all of our lives possible, not just people their own age, but people so much older than they are. There's this story that I'm waiting to tell for the right time, but I know this family in Michigan who, when the daughter came out as trans, I believe she's only like 5 at the time, when she started like coming into her gender identity, her parent came out as trans too. Like it wasn't, parent comes out as trans and then, kid does, in this sort of like grooming narrative that you often hear, right? Like grooming children to be trans. No, it was the kid showing their parent the way, right? It was the daughter like showing their mother, because it was their mother that came out, right? That like it's possible for you to be yourself, presenting that as being a possibility in a way that she just never had seen for herself. She never thought she could like live a life as a trans woman, but here she goes, and she's like in her 40s, right? So I hope that when people read this book and they hear about all these kids, these extraordinary, ordinary kids carving out space in their own communities, they realize that they can do that too in whatever age they happen to be, right? If they
Oh,
are
that's
13 or if they're like 80.
yeah, it's so real. And I think about how like what a beautiful, I mean, this sounds like so corny, right? But it is such a beautiful thing to be queer and trans because you are constantly questioning, what feels good is like presentation, things like that. Like maybe one day you like lipstick and the next day you're like, oh, that is so not me anymore. Because when you said the lipstick thing, I was like, in college, like I would wear lipstick. And when you were talking about wearing lipstick, the thought of putting lipstick on, it just like gave me this visceral, like, oh no, right? And it's, as adults, you feel so fixed in this identity that you formed for yourself over the years in a way that like we chastise young people for trying on different pronouns, trying on different names, trying on different ways of presenting their gender, and you say like, oh well, clearly that shows why it's not okay because they're too young to have their minds made up or whatever. And it's like, why do you have to have your mind made up as an adult either? Like, why not give yourself the room to try on these different, whether that's like literally trying on different outfits or just exploring different ways of, doing gender, so to speak. Like maybe you do feel like you want to try on lipstick and maybe the next day you decide not to, nail polish, like whatever. Maybe you do want to present more masculinely, feminine, maybe you want neither, right? Why do you have to have this fixed identity? And that's so hard to break that mold. It's so hard to, you know, even if it's like a situation where you're pretty confident that you're going to be accepted in the folks that you're telling, it's still this admission of like, it's like reintroducing yourself to someone. And that is so hard, especially as you get older. But I love that show the power in these young people doing that because it is inspiring to older folks as much as it can be the reverse.
Yeah, but it's really interesting. And that I hope that this is one of the big takeaways from the book that you often hear Republican lawmakers refer to these kids as just being like gender confused, right? That
Right.
they're just like confused now and they'll figure it out later. And, it's just, they'll at some point they'll start identifying with the gender that they were assigned at birth and they're just going through a phase. It's the kind of stuff bi people and lesbians have been hearing forever, right?
Mhm.
So they're just trying it on a new population to see if it works. But the thing is with these kids is there is so much in their lives that they're uncertain about. They're uncertain about their futures, about like so much about their like identities, like who they like or like what they like, what their interests are, just kind of figuring things out and like, kind of like playing with the watercolors a bit. But the thing that no one expressed any confusion about was their gender identity.
Mhm.
It's like life is very confusing. It's very confusing to be a kid. It's very confusing to be a person in the world and have to figure yourself out. But like when it comes to who these kids are in terms of their gender, there was no confusion at all. They seemed very, very, very certain about this. They're so certain that they're willing to endure like all of this trauma and discrimination to continue being themselves. Like you've got to be really certain if you want to be like a trans person of color in Alabama, right? Like you've got to be really, really, really sure. And Ridian there's so much he's still figuring out about his life and where his future's headed, what happens to him in like 20, 30 years. But when it comes to the boy he is, like that's not up for debate.
Right.
That's the one thing he does know.
Right. Absolutely. Like no one is going to voluntarily subject themselves to, rejection from, potential rejection from family, from other folks in their lives, ridicule and just hate, right? If they aren't absolutely certain that this is who they are. We ask young kids all the time, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like we're asking people to like conjure up this, definitive aspect of their future identities, right? We go, oh, you're going to be a firefighter. How cute. Okay. And then we like, take that and run with it. But when we ask young people to share facets of their identity, relating to gender, right? It's like, oh, well, you're too young to know that, right? We don't embrace it in that same way when that is something that is like so core to one's identity, like they know, right? So I think that, we can't just pick and choose when we trust young people. We can't just pick and choose when we affirm young people when they tell us who they are, right? We have to either all at once say, yes, I believe you, or question why we're not believing this young person.
Yeah, and all that does is it allows Republicans and conservative lawmakers to disengage, to simply not listen. Because when we've decided that who these kids are and their conception of who they are doesn't have any value, it then, like everything after that, becomes a moot point. There's no reason to continue the conversation or to really engage. And with this book, I know I don't have the power to make every GOP politician in the entire country read it, but I do hope it forces a couple people out there to engage with the conversation, that it opens their eyes, that it connects them to the dialogue in a way that they just weren't willing to do before they could because they were making up all these excuses for themselves, because I do think that that's just an excuse of deciding that these kids don't know who they are. Like it's an excuse not to connect with them, it's an excuse to not recognize their humanity. But this book is all about recognizing the humanity of people. It's literally just like 244 pages of like connecting with these kids lived experiences, and I hope people are able to like let down their walls enough to really let the thoughts and opinions and experiences in and to be changed by them, because I do think it could really change some things. I think it could be a transformative experience for them if they're willing to let it.
Absolutely. Well, Nico, it has been such a delight to talk to you about yourself and also this book. And I just so hope that everyone who's listening now and then some goes out and gets a copy for themselves and has the opportunity to have their life changed by these stories. So if you could just share, like, where can folks find your book? When can they find it? And what are some other ways that they can connect with you and your work?
Sure. And honestly, why stop at one copy? Two copies, three copies,
The
stocking stuffers.
holidays are right around the corner. Exactly. Yes.
Shoot them out of cannons at like football games, pew, pew, pew. You
Yes,
know,
exactly.
everybody gets a book, like under Oprah seats, right? That sort of
Right.
thing. But
Absolutely.
you can buy it on October 8th. That is our official release day. Um, the where you can buy it, bookshop.org is a really great resource that sort of supports like local independent booksellers all across the country. I would also say check out your local indie bookseller. You can literally just Google like indie bookseller, name of your city, right? And find, whatever vendor locally is selling this book who isn't, Amazon. Please don't do that. Right.
Mhm.
So please do that if that's an option for you. If your indie bookseller is not selling it, you have the ability to have it ordered in. They will order it for you and it'll be there in 7 days, which I imagine isn't too much longer than Amazon. You can do that. That's actually very valuable for a book like this because a lot of the time, let's say, dog-eared books, your like local bookseller, which is a name I just made up. They don't have it, they order it in for you, then they might decide that they want to start carrying it, right? So then they have that book for anybody else who comes in and needs these stories, right? Needs to hear them. Really, a book like this is going to be fighting to get that kind of distribution in bookstores across the country to like just get eyes on something like this.
to
So
to get
please
eyes
help.
on it, let alone, hopefully doesn't get banned, right, from the eyes who need to see it. So I think and we don't have to open up that conversation, but I think
No, please don't.
I
But
think that is like absolutely super valuable to talk about, like getting this not only in your own hands, but to ensure that it's in others' hands as well. So
yeah, but if you are intent on like supporting major corporations, I would at least ask you to just order it from Barnes and Noble rather than Amazon. Just don't do Amazon. They're destroying the planet, and destroying like so I don't know, so many things about the way that like society functions, and in terms of like small mom and pop like not only bookstores but just like sellers. Like it's Amazon has been incredibly destructive to their business model. Barnes and Noble, sure, it's corporate books, right? But at least they're sort of an underdog here, right? It's a bookstore that is still fighting to survive the way that other bookstores are. So if you've got a Barnes and Noble in your city and you'll love Barnes and Noble, give them a couple bucks. But I would definitely say if you have the ability to support your indie bookseller, do that first because they really need you.
absolutely. Well, I can't think of better words to end on than that. Nico, it has been such a delight to get to talk to you, and I just look forward to, getting my own physical copy of this book and sharing these stories with others as well. So thank you for being on this episode of Speaking Queerly.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And also, you can follow me at Queer News Daily, where I promise not to engage in any more anti-Amazon rants. Actually, I can't promise that, but you can follow me anyway.
Amazing.